Hello, I'm John Boaz. I'm a board member with the Rancho Bernardo Historical Society. We're at the museum on Monday, April 6th to talk with Bruce Cornblum about his role in the development of Rancho Bernardo Community Park. He is an attorney. He was a local attorney at the time that the park opened in 1983. A 38-acre park at that time that included 8 ball fields. He was president of the RB Recreation Council in the years 1984 to 1991. He started the RB Sports Hall of Fame in 1986 to honor youth sports volunteers. And he served on the boards of the Youth Soccer Club, the Youth Basketball, Little League, and Pony League. And as a result, he was inducted into the RB Hall of Fame in 1997. Bruce, we're delighted to have you with us to talk about the park. Let me begin by asking how you came about your interest in sports and recreation.
Well, the first thing that happened was I found Rancho Bernardo. And at the time, in 1976, my sons were age 5 and 9. And it was a much smaller town, and I noticed over the first year or so that much of the activity of Rancho Bernardo younger family was around their children and youth sports. And that inevitably brought me into contact with, but I was never a player. So I didn't jump into coaching or anything. But when I thought about it, I felt that if I was going to decide to grow up with my kids, which I decided at that time to become active in their lives, I had to know about the games that they were playing. So I studied them. I sought out professional players and asked them if they give me an hour of their advice. And I learned about 2 sports in particular, baseball and basketball. I
understand one of your sons is a baseball coach to this day.
Yes. In fact, I was surprised because everybody in my family is connected with the law. Going back to my aunt, who was the first judge in Buffalo, a lady judge. But he did not want to be a lawyer. He said I worked too hard, and I saw that he fell in love with the community. His friends were all playing sports, and he became very involved in baseball, and it kept him happy. And he continued playing throughout high school, dedicated himself, and ended up, unfortunately for me, going to college in Texas on a baseball scholarship, and is now a resident of Texas.
Well, obviously your leadership has something to do with your legal training and background and experience. Tell us a little bit about where you went to school and how you got to San Diego and what your area of interest in law is.
Well, I came to San Diego. It was, when I look back on it, an interesting story. I was a lobbyist for the trial lawyers in Sacramento, and I would present legislation to various committees. And one of the committees was chaired by a senator from San Diego, James Mills, and a non-lawyer. And he was a scholar, a historical scholar of the history of San Diego. And so he, for some reason, took to me. And his advisor, one day after presenting some legislation to his committee, he asked if I would hang around. And he said his advisor was going to become a judge, and he wanted to replace that political and historical advisor with me. And he said, did you ever consider moving to San Diego? So I said, obviously not. And he said, well, come on down and visit. I have a place that I think you and your wife and your 2 young children would love. And we drove up a two-lane highway out of San Diego. My heart was pounding because I didn't see any houses. And we came to San Diego, to Rancho Bernardo. And he helped pick out the house I'm still living in. And then we saw the community, which was much smaller then, have a connection through their families. And so I became involved in sports, and my practice, I practice as a trial lawyer in the field of insurance. So that's basically the answer to that.
Okay, thank you. I understand that Avco Community Developers took initial responsibility for recreation in this newly created community. Could you talk a little bit about the evolution from Avco's involvement to the involvement of RB Swim and Tennis and the Westwood Club, on to the Recreation Council and ultimately the community park?
In one sentence.
Maybe that'll require a paragraph.
Well, some of that answer I learned of. I was not a participant in the actual arrangement of the present park or the acquisition of that park for recreation. But at the time, of course, Rancho Bernardo was originally an adult community. But because there was a lot of industry that came to Rancho Bernardo, Hewlett-Packard and others, residential communities were needed. And so you had Westwood and maybe Gatewood Hills in the early 70s. Well, what happened was that transformed the community, and children had to have places to play games. When I first moved here, there were 4 fields that Hewlett-Packard allowed the community to use. And it was great fun, but then Hewlett-Packard gave almost like a year notice that they were going to have to withdraw and give different use to those fields. And so the community had no place to put the children. Now, when AFCO was developing the residential areas, they convinced the city of San Diego to allow them not to dedicate a park for recreation, but rather to have 2 recreation clubs. One, Westwood, would have 2 baseball fields, and the other was swim and tennis, which had no baseball fields, but a lot of other activities, which was consumed by the parents. And so, given the expansion of the city, of Rancho Bernardo, the withdrawal of the fields, a group that was ahead of me went down and lobbied for the city to give us a community park.
Ahead of you as a recreation council, or?
Ahead of me as a resident.
As residents.
They were more familiar, and I was just coming into community activities.
I see.
And so the park is far different from other community parks. I learned that the city of San Diego is extremely dedicated to outdoor recreation. And in fact, at that time, the 3rd largest budget item behind police and fire was recreation, the Department of Parks and Recreation. And the city's plan at that time, it may have changed over the years, which after I ceased my involvement in these activities, that every home be within a 1/4 mile of a park. And so you had neighborhood parks, which were 1 to 3 acres, which did not have facilities on them. The next, just grass type of situation. The next level was community parks. And they were generally about 10 to 18 acres. And they had permanent facilities as well as fields. Well, by the time our need hit us, the need to house children so that they could compete, the basic town was built, and we couldn't fit a community park as such. So the city gave us the present 38 acres. to develop. After that, the fields became the first prime item, and within a year thereafter, we had 8 fields with nothing else. If you go to the community park now, you would have to envision that all there was 8 fields, grass, and nothing else. And so there was a local recreation council, but at that time, which I was invited into in this last year, they were committed to building an outdoor bowl that could house entertainment for a large amount of people. There was an activity in Rancho Bernardo called the Symphony on the Greens, where the Rancho Bernardo
RBN?
the RBN, every Sunday allowed their greens, not their greens, but their fairways to be used where people would come with blankets and sit and listen to professional groups, the Kingston Trio, the Mills Brothers, but they then withdrew and wanted to end that commitment. And so this group was formed to build an outdoor bowl. Well, what happened was that group had to lobby the city for permits, for approval of plans, and the Department of Parks and Recreation, the director, said there's a conflict between recreation and the bowl, because the local committee should not have to lobby for anything. They should carry out Parks and Recreation. So he came up here, it was actually my second meeting, and he was very stern, and he said, from here on in, I am withdrawing Parks and Recreation from this group. And if you want to form a new group, that's fine. If you don't want to form a new group, I'll appoint one. And so...
Who is he?
Oh, that was George Loveland, who was the Director of Parks and Recreation.
Director of Parks and Rec.
I had met him, his son was growing up with my younger son, and as they grew up, he lived in San Pasqual. And so I had met him because he was rooting for his son and I was rooting for my son. But the parents were rooting together.
Yeah.
And so and one other person, so that meant 25 did not want to concern themselves with Parks and Recreation. And that was Stu Glassman. So Stu and I were the only two that withdrew. And I went down and met Loveland, and I said, what's it all about? What should we do to create, to continue on with recreation? And he said, he gave me the history of parks, and he said, you have fields up there. He said, that place has to be developed. And from my perspective, it's developed by the community decisions that are made within fair rules. And so Stu and I and one other individual, Paul Brown, who was with the paper, the local Rancho Bernardo News, I think it was. He knew a lot about the history of the community, which I felt I didn't. And we created bylaws, and I said, there's one other thing. I said, this is such a community, an active community, the future board should be elected, not appointed by anybody. The people should decide who is going to represent them in the activities. And I had to sell Loveland on that idea because the other community parks, of which there was approximately 51, they were all run by athletic participants, jocks, who could become members just by attending 3 meetings, and then they would run the place. And he said that it was a fair idea to have it. He says, if it could be arranged, he says, I agree. And that's how our Recreation Council came as an elected body. And thereafter, Stu and I, and with the assistance of Paul Brown, we said we got to pick a board. And we got to make it a broad-based board. and that's what excited.
Very good. Tell us a little bit about how the site was selected for the community park. That maybe was before your time, but you may have some recollection about that. I'm curious because you mentioned the average community park in San Diego was like 10 to 18 acres, and we're fortunate to have a much larger community park.
Right. Well, the people that lived here at that time were very active in keeping the land as it was in nature. And so you have, from Rancho Bernardo to the ocean, vast amounts of land that are preserved for posterity. And there was at that time, there was a lake called Lake Hodges, but it was a true lake. And it had water in it. I don't know what happened to the water, but there's a bunch of trees out there now. But next to that, there was a field that the city felt it could carve out that was suitable because it was flat. And so we ended up with 38 acres, not knowing, I again, was not a personal participant in that, but I became active as they started building the park. So it was by happenstance, circumstance, nothing planned with regards to the boundaries of the park.
So you were not involved in the original development of the ball fields on the land that presently is the park, but at the point you came in, the old rec council interested in a bowl evolved into an elected council, and that group was then responsible for the further development of the park.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the steps.
Well, because Stu and I agreed, Stu was retired and a successful businessman who moved to Rancho Bernardo and developed a sincere love for the place. And I was still working, so I said, we're both going to do this. We have to go out and select people. You have a lot of time to do that. Let's talk about it. Who do we want? And so we went over we sat down one time with a Bernardo News, and we were reading each community's activities to see if we could identify an individual who was active in recreation and who appeared to be accepted by that neighborhood in Rancho Bernardo as a leader. The first one that I read a lot about was Ed Brown in Oaks North. Oaks North had a little community recreation center. And so I wrote down Ed Brown. And then we had a basketball coach who had just won 3 CIF championships named Neville Sainer. And basketball was a big thing in Rancho Bernardo in its infancy, and of course still is. And so I went out and talked to him, and he initially didn't know what I was talking about. But I said, we need you because every kid who bounces a basketball knows your name. And if you could come out and lend us your expertise and just your presence, you're going to put a lot of smiles on people's faces. And he says, okay, I'll give it a try. And then we knew we needed tennis courts, so there was actually a pro named Melissa Porzak. And Melissa was a very attractive, tough tennis player. She was very good, but she knew about the history of tennis when we talked to her. And she said that she felt that she had enough knowledge that if a place was built, that she could put it all together. And then I remember there was, at one meeting, there was an old man, an 85-year-old man who came in, and he said, I was wondering if I could address the board. And I said, certainly. And he loved roller skating. He was a roller skater. He was a dentist, a retired dentist. And he wanted to build a, I can't think of the name, that round thing that's at the
The
park.
gazebo?
A gazebo. And I said, well, what are we gonna do with the gazebo? And he said, well, kids could roller skate in the gazebo. And I looked at the city, which gave us an advisor to tell us about what we could and couldn't do. And he said, we don't have any gazebos. But we thought it was a great idea because at the time the park was built, there were no trees. The original person gave us these little cheap trees that were maybe 6 inches high and said, come back in 30 years and you'll have shade. Anyway, I remember Dr. Maxwell, and I remember when we told him a month later that we wanted to accept his idea. He had plans and everything, and we took those plans, and that's how the gazebo started. There was another businessman, Frank Berry, who owned a sports shop in town, and so we went, and that was our first board. And
So we're up to about 9, 10,
I think I ended at 9. I can't remember 1 or 2. There was, there was one as the casas were being built, and just about, they were just opened. We felt that it would be important to have a person from the casas come down. And there were a lot of...
this is the retirement village, just north of the park.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I noticed that lawn bowling was very big amongst many of the seniors. And I knew nothing about lawn bowling. And so I obtained the name of the world's greatest lawn bowler, who was in, I think, lived in Washington, someplace, Seattle, because I learned that you had to build them in a special way, special grass, special everything. And so he came down and he told the board about lawn bowling. So I said, well, how much is one of these things? And he said, no, he said, you have to keep in mind, you don't build one, you have to build 2. And I said, why? He said, well, 1 can be used, but 2 will allow for national and even international competition. If you have 1, you close out that field. So anyway, it ended up that the field cost $350,000, and it had to be kept up in a special way every year. So, so it was those types of, Melissa put together organized the tennis. We encouraged the lawn bowlers in order to pay for their facility. I mean, the facility was paid for out of funds that the city had available for us. But the lawn bowlers would determine how many lawn bowlers there were, the annual cost, which was about $25,000 to $30,000, divide the members into the cost, and that was the dues. And so the park developed in incremental ways in that fashion. And then the park was so big.
So you're saying that essentially the cost of the lawn bowling was borne by the lawn bowlers?
Yes.
Was this concept then extended across basketball and tennis and?
Yes. Most people, as the groups developed, whenever they had disputes, and some of the disputes were unbelievable. I mean, the hatreds between members or whatever the thing was, they felt they had to come to the Recreation Council to resolve it. And so we had disputes from the lawn bowlers, from the tennis players, from, to start with those 2. And we had no time for business. And so we decided that my legal expertise, or my legal background, came into play because I was able to write bylaws. I was very knowledgeable in Robert's Rules of Order. And so I said, look, let's get these groups out of here so we can do business. And we decided that each group would be self-governing. I wrote the bylaws for them and they could change them. The only time they could come to the Recreation Council was if the dispute was so irreconcilable that we had to step in and end it.
So you were an appeals court.
An appeals court. And we did that for the tennis players, and fortunately, no appeal ever thereafter came.
Oh.
They took care of it themselves. But it allowed for each one to then develop their own history, their own traditions, their own practices, and it ended up to be the best thing we could do.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Ed Brown Senior Center was founded in 1989. You've already commented that Ed Brown was one of the original board, and you commented that Casa lying just north perhaps had some influence in that development. Is there anything more that you can tell us about Ed Brown and the development, the plans for the senior center, the cost of that perhaps?
Ed Brown was a very, very, very special person. He was a businessman who, in his retirement, he was successful in whatever he did. I didn't really go into people's backgrounds that much. But he committed himself to helping people's businesses for nothing. And so his personality was extremely important to the development because people liked him, politicians liked him. He knew the facts. And so one day he said, there's a person living in our community named Remy Hudson, who's a member of who's a director of the Jocelyn Center. And I didn't know what the Jocelyn Center was. So he introduced me to Remy Hudson, who was a senior, I would say in his 80s at the time. And they were running 29 senior centers in Southern California.
The Jocelyn
Group.
People.
And he gave me the history of the Jocelyn Group by telling me that Marcellus Jocelyn was a very wealthy business person who retired in I'll say the early 50s. And he was very interested in helping seniors, and he created a fund of, I think it was $4 or $5 million at that time. And he took his board at that time, who were his good friends, and named them as the committee, and Remy was one of them. But he said, he says, now we're all up in age, and we're running 29 as an overview committee. And we don't have any more time in our lives or more time in the day for another center. So Ed said, Remy, why don't you just come down, let us show you the park. And we want to show you one other thing. There's something called the Casa de las Campanas. That's opening, we'll explain it to you. So we went out to the field, and he looked up, and he said, oh my God. He said, look, he says, all I can do is, I can get you the money, but we cannot run it. You have to do it yourself, or you have to make an arrangement with the city. So we went out to get a bid. We got a bid, and it ended up to be like a 5,000 or 5,500 square foot building that had movable walls and multi-purpose use. And that became the facility. And so I think it was 350,000. So I met him at a bank on Bernardo Center, and it was funny. He takes out a checkbook and he says, who should I make the check out to? And I said, well, to Bruce Cornblum. And he said, that's you, isn't it? And I said, yes. He said, well, give me another name. So I said, well, try the city of San Diego. Oh. So we deposit that in, and that was the origin of the building. And then after it was finished, I remember he said, you have to hire a director. So Ed, Stu, and I met with this woman who was, I can't remember her name, but she was delightful. As soon as you walked in, you knew that this woman should run this place. And so it took off like gangbusters. The first name of the facility was the Johnson Center.
Mhm.
And then it was changed because that did not have meaning to people that were using it. So there was named Reamy Hudson. Reamy Hudson ultimately ended up to be in the same group I was in when we got elected to the Hall of Fame. The town, Rancho Bernardo, put him in the Hall of Fame, properly so. But of course, Reamy wasn't that active in the community, and people didn't identify with Reamy. But Ed was still active, and Ed was active in the planning of activities at the Hudson Center. And so it was then, the board then voted, it was after I was off the board, but they voted to name it the Ed Brown facility. And so that's the, how we got it, and how it happened, and I still go by that place, and every time I look at, just driving by, I think about Reedy, and I think about Ed.
Wonderful. The Recreation Center was built in 1995
Yes.
and named for Stuart Glassman, whom you've already referred to, in 2002. Can you tell us a little bit more about not only Glassman's role in the development of the center, but the Rec Council
Yes.
and how that evolved?
Well, we knew we needed a gymnasium, the gymnasium at the Westwood Club, which was holding all of the basketball games, was just overwhelmed with numbers. And of course, the adults wanted to play and have activity, and we needed just more recreation facilities, whether it was for dinners or whatever. And by a sheer coincidence, I was having a trial, and it was a friendly business trial, and so I was friendly with the attorney on the other side. Not that that had anything to do with the outcome of the case. But after the case, he was a community person like I was, and we started talking about our communities. And he was in Carlsbad. And so he said, we just finished the building of a facility. And I said, what's it all about? And he explained it, and I said, boy, that would fit with our place. And he says, well, I'll tell you what. He says, I'm the chairman of the Recreation Council, and I could get you the plans. And I said, really? He said, yeah. He says, you know, they cost about $150,000 to the architects charge us. He said, but we have no need for them. So I called George Loveland, and I said, I told that story, and I said, could you call Carlsbad and talk to their Parks and Recreation Department and see if you could get those plans? I said, this building is unbelievable. So he couldn't believe it. And sure enough, they gave the plans to Loveland for nothing. And that was the origin of the plans. There were some modifications caused by the San Diego Engineering Department for various reasons, one of which was cost. But it's virtually the twin of the Carlsbad recreation facility. And of course, Stu was very active in that. And again, as I pointed out earlier, Ed was retired, and so he could do his thing. Stu just fell in love with the concept. And he was on it all the time. He was with the engineers, he was with, we had disputes with the City of San Diego Engineering Department. They wanted to charge us to review the plans that were already approved by the City of Carlsbad. And that was a political thing, but we had to pay them thousands, of which we protested. and negotiated, but he was involved with that. And, but ultimately, the facility started after I left in 1991. But it was Stu's love, and where Ed was involved with and had this love affair with senior citizens, planning for them, and of course he was always down there at the tennis courts. That was Stu's bag, the recreation facility.
Well, you talked about the main facilities, the Brown Senior Center and the recreation facility, but no park is complete without lighting for the ball fields and snack bar for the parents during softball tournaments and the like.
Well, I just thought of a circumstance where I was interested in making it a fundraising type of thing, but I didn't have a concept of how do you raise money in running a public park. But there were always demands. All the youth groups needed something more, or knew this or knew that because of the passage of time and wearing out of things. And so I contacted the state of California Department of Recreation and asked them if they had funds available so that we could do various things. So the director of Parks and Recreation, who I didn't know, but he knew Senator Mills, and that came up in the conversation so I could get his attention. He came down here, he said, I'll meet you here at 8 o'clock in the morning on a weekday. So I get out there a little ahead of time, and there was this man, and I said, are you Mr. So-and-so? And he said, yes. And he says, I've never seen anything like this. This is the most beautiful community park I have seen in the state of California. So I said, really? I said, does that mean that we'll get funds? And he says, no. He says, that's the reason you won't get funds. He says, because you should see some of the facilities that I help manage. And he says, we only have enough funds to give to those areas of those parks that needed to build, needed to improve, all sorts of that type of thing. And he said, but I'll tell you, he says, I'm going to remember this place. And so we needed other things. We needed lighting. The cost of lighting a field is unbelievable. It's $150,000 at that time to light a field. We needed a snack bar. Of course, you have to build these things like war bunkers because of looting and destruction that takes place. And they literally are. I mean, a tank couldn't shoot that thing down. And so a dear friend of mine, a retired builder who was active in athletics, O.V. Kelson, agreed to build the snack bar. Well, we needed money. The city did not want to pay or allow its funds to be used for the snack bar. And so the board came upon an idea of raising money through selling for, I forgot what the price was, maybe $500, and you could get your name on the snack bar. And we ultimately were able to raise enough money, and so if you go to the snack bar, you'll see the names of all the people or businesses that contributed, and you have O.V. Kelson's name, as the builder. We had to build bathrooms, and the bathrooms are as they are, but we made sure that they were multi-usable so that you could store equipment and those types of things. And so there were a lot of things that we needed, and we needed more activity from the city to maintain the fields because we were expanding so. But let me say this about the city of San Diego and their participation in this. George Loveland told me that he would, at our future meetings, at our first meeting when we were talking about formulas, assign 2 staff people to come to every one of your meetings. And that these people will be knowledgeable in practice and procedure of the San Diego Parks and Recreation, the history of things so that you can understand what you're doing as you come up with ideas, what funds would be available, and what things you could not do, either because of code or whatever. And those people were unbelievable. They were professional recreation people who you could go out, they could serve for anybody, but they then put suits on and maintained their employment within the Department of Recreation. And it was their guidance, and they would research things. I would look over and say, hey, is it possible to do this after listening to what the group wanted? And the Department of Recreation was, I heard that it's impossible to work with governments. The city of San Diego's participation made this park what it is. I didn't talk about the financing of the park. AFCO was responsible to pay to the Department of Recreation $200 for every living group, or living unit in Rancho Bernardo. The projected population of Rancho Bernardo was 40,000. It probably is maybe 42,000. At that time, it was 15,000 when I was getting involved. And so he said that you have available to you, now this is when I came in, the fields were there, but nothing else. You have available to you between $200,000 and $300,000, but it'll grow as it did, and we acquired more money. But those are the sources of funds that helped build that park. And that park, I don't know what the total cost is, but it was massive, a lot of money. Another thing, there was a political issue that arose between the Rec Council and the Department of Recreation and the City of San Diego. We had to fight for certain facilities. Basketball was a significant sport. Rancho Bernardo had all the sports. We had pony teams and they were competitive, but the kids in school, at least at my son's ages, baseball and basketball was the cat's meow. And they all played baseball and basketball. That's why we have so many good young athletes come out of Rancho Bernardo, and we still do. The planned park had maybe a basketball court. They didn't have, one basket. And so I went down on a friendly day and I said, hey, this is the importance of basketball to this community. And they said there's not enough. It will cost $350,000 to build what we have there now. And I said, well, we have to build it. And they said, no. We have other needs because of your park. And
you're speaking now of the
basketball.
Outdoor basketball.
Yeah, outdoor basketball court. And so it took a long time, but finally the head of the engineering department retired, fortunately, and a new one came in, whose son was a basketball player.
Helps.
And so I met with him, and he says, you got it. He said, that place needs, with that history, that place needs that, those facilities so the kids could practice. We ran out of room at the swim and tennis club. They only had a small basketball court. We couldn't practice at the Westwood Club because that was used for games 24 hours a day. And so that's how that came about. So I'm sure there's many stories that I can't remember at this time, but let me just, oh, there was one other thing that raised millions of dollars for the city that came from our board. 8 fields can raise a lot of money for a lot of groups because there are softball groups, for example, that charge each team maybe $500 to enter a tournament. And so with 8 fields, you could run 4 games a day. So that's 4 times 32 times 500. They're raising a lot of money. And they would leave afterwards, not give our community anything. And the fields were damaged. And the local groups had to use their little budgets to this is getting to the idea of how could we raise money.
Mm-hmm.
So one day, we talked about it, but we didn't know how to solve the problem. One day, a guy came in who was just the most arrogant president of the Cancer Society. And he wanted to use the facilities to raise money. So, you know, what are you going to say, the Cancer Society, no? But the guy was so arrogant. So I happened to say, oh, by the way, I said, are you guys going to clean up after, you know, you have your field? And he says, this is the Cancer Society. You can't expect us to clean up. So I said, yes, I can. I said, either you promise to clean up or go someplace else. And this guy looked at me, but he had no place to go. So he says, all right. So I called Loveland, and I said, does this happen all over the city where these people come in, these groups, you know, well-intended groups? I have nothing, obviously, against the Cancer Society. But they use the facilities, raise money, and don't share their proceeds. He says, yeah. And I said, I have an idea. I said, anybody that comes in has to give that local group, recreation facility, 10% of its gross, whatever it is. And they have to give us what they have in the bank before the thing starts and an accounting afterwards, and that includes drinks. So he said, wow. He said, you mean for all the facilities? He says, that's a lot of money. And I said, is it unreasonable? And he says, I'll get you a spot on the, before the city council. Can you draw something up, an ordinance? I said, I think so. So I went down there, and that was the only time in front of the city council, and I looked up, and there they were. And they said, why are you here? What's this all about? And I told them about what happened, just like I told you, and I told you 50 groups, and I said all the money, the millions that are raised. And the city of San Diego, not the city of San Diego, but the local groups, the children, need money to replace and re-clean, and you come in afterwards and you have to have money for your cleanup people and janitors. And one councilman said, what took you so long to get here? It passed, I think it was 9-0 within seconds, and they said thank you. But it was that particular thing that then started, we went from $100 in the bank to thousands. And when I left, there must have been close to, I don't know, $100,000 in the bank that was available to the community for doing whatever and building whatever the community wanted.
Well, that's a fabulous story. I must tell you, Bruce, after having spent hour after hour watching a granddaughter play softball in Rancho Bernardo Community Park and almost as many hours watching a grandson play basketball in the rec center, I'm personally very grateful to you. The museum is very grateful to you for sharing your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.